I traveled to Western Ukraine because we have sites over here. Not because President Biden is just a few kilometers away at the moment, but because we had other important things to do. So currently, again, with some security precautions, because for example, when you travel, you hear air raids and you see some explosions. For example, this time it was on my right, but at the same time, again, we're not afraid to an extent when we're just panicking and we cannot move. So we still need to leave and we still need to move. In a nutshell, because Putin gets around $1 billion per day from his exports of energy. That's a lot of money, and that keeps Putin's bloody regime afloat. So if the West and the whole world wants to have some crushing sanctions over Russia, it should include a full embargo on Russian gas, oil, coal, energy in general. I would say to Canada that Canada should produce as much gas and oil as it can to increase exports to Europe so that Europe is less dependent on Russian gas. And then Europe and other parts of the world can and should transition to renewables, to non-fossil fuels. But this transition should be coordinated with geopolitical sustainability of the energy sector, because the free world cannot depend on rogue regimes like Putin for a little bit cleaner energy like gas, for example. So it's really suicidal when Germany shuts down their coal plants, their nuclear plants, just to depend more and more on Russia. So I would understand if they, for example, shut down coal because they develop wind and solar. But when they choose deliberately to depend on Russian gas, that's suicidal. They should stop buying Russian gas, and they can and should use more of coal and nuclear. But they should also, for example, increase the level of energy efficiency. They can, for example, decrease an average temperature of heating. Currently, on average, it's 22 degrees Celsius. I would say for Anglo-Saxon countries, it's a little bit too warm. And every decrease by 1 degree Celsius means minus 10 billion cubic meters of gas consumption in Europe. So sometimes you can just afford to live one winter in a slightly colder room. But in general, if you do some smart thermal insulation, if you do some heat pumps, there are many things you can do to decrease consumption of natural gas and fossil fuels. It's also a good way to make a more sustainable electricity grid. And not even saying that, for example, such technologies as batteries to grid can also help. So there are many ways, again, in the midterm, how you can make this whole energy sector of the EU more environmentally sustainable and geopolitically sustainable. I'm angry that Germany, other EU countries, to some extent, the whole world, did not do enough in 2014 when Putin invaded Ukraine. Should the sanctions that we see at the moment be imposed in 2014, we would not have all these horrors at the moment. So from that perspective, of course, I'm angry. I'm angry that Germany in 2015, after the invasion, started construction of Nord Stream 2. And it was, of course, an encouragement, a green light for Putin, because he interpreted it as basically a sign that he can invade Russia's neighbors. He can basically nourish this. Sorry to say, but it's to some extent like Nazist feeling of the Russian nation, of this supremacy over other nations. You see, and Putin was showing to Russians that, look, we can invade other nations. You are superior to other nations, because even then, the West still works with us. The West still accepts us because we're such a super nation, you see, and that's something that, of course, is dangerous. I believe that Ukraine will win, and I believe that it won't be a very straightforward way. I believe that Putin regime will lose, and because it's just the logic of the history. So it's rather logical when a populist autocrat in a developing democracy chooses to play this like Nazi card. But it's not sustainable. You see, the whole world will not accept it. People all over the world will not accept it. And that's why Putin is on the wrong side of the history, and we are on the right side of the history. That's why we will win. When and how, that's an open question. So unfortunately, it seems like Putin can be stopped only with force. And thanks to our like heroic military and people all over Ukraine, we are fighting and we are showing we're defeating Russian army in many places around Ukraine. So that's makes me optimistic about our victory. Probably during a war, it's difficult to maintain some sense of humor, but we're making a lot of fun of Russian army exactly because of corruption. So they were building these Potemkin villages with their military strengths, but apparently it was so rotten with corruption that in their tanks, their equipment, their food, you see, everything shows that it's substandard, you see. So they would have some outdated food packages. They would have some really rusty tanks and rusty equipment, some old Soviet equipment just like painted like it's new. Or they would have some casks that would just be with some kind of flannel over it so that it looks like it's modern, but underneath this cloth it's basically some Soviet era cask helmet. So that's why, again, corruption of the Russian state and Russian army helps us a lot. We have a lot of brave soldiers, but we need more of modern weapons, especially air defense. And that's, again, as I say, that's the most important thing, because we need to stop him militarily. There is no other way. But also, there should be some effective sanctions on the Putin's regime, so that it cannot replenish its resources, so that it cannot nourish this smug feeling of Russians who support Putin's regime. So that everybody understands that Russia is not a superpower that has this right to subjugate other nations, you see. Sometimes, again, it's not like we challenge this idea, but we still say that this solidarity should be about confronting Putin, not about appeasing Putin. But currently, again, our leadership is still very sensitive about consolidating the West, so that we do not we do not cause some kind of division inside the anti-Putin coalition. So that's why we are very careful in terms of our consultations with the US government and with some major EU partners in terms of what should be done and when. So we still believe that NATO can and should enforce a no-flight zone and to give us modern air defense systems right now. So that's why we would prefer NATO to be faster and bolder in terms of what NATO is doing. But at the same time, we are grateful to the support we are getting from the NATO countries. And we don't blame NATO for the war. We blame Putin's regime. So Putin's regime is the only one to be blamed. But of course, again, we would want to have more support and more immediate support, more decisive support from the NATO. We understand that a diplomatic solution should lead to Ukraine getting back Ukrainian Crimea and Ukrainian Donbass. So we're not forgetting anything. We're not forgetting that it's Ukraine. But what we're saying that we understand that conquering Crimea and conquering Donbass at the moment will or can lead to some atrocities, or how to call it, some basically, so that the humanitarian side is also important. So that's why we would prefer a diplomatic solution. So we're saying that we're seeking a diplomatic solution, and we can even put it on paper that Ukraine is seeking a diplomatic solution to return Crimea and Donbass. But we were never saying that we would forget about Crimea and Donbass, or we would not try to get it back. People can see this horrible war crimes that Russian army is committing, and not allowing humanitarian corridors, some destruction of the civilian infrastructure, purposeful. It's a war crime. So we are saying that even while we are having this war, you should still, again, follow the rules. And no-flight zone, it's a slightly different case, because here we're saying that the damage to civilians can be so severe that the NATO countries cannot just stay away, and they should recognize that in order to prevent some catastrophic events, like, for example, explosions on some nuclear power plants, or, for example, humanitarian catastrophes in some besieged cities, there should be no flight zone over, for example, ideally over entire Ukraine, but at least over, for example, nuclear power plants, over humanitarian corridors, over areas that are currently like areas for refugees and temporarily displaced people from other regions from Ukraine. So there should be at least some safe spots for civilians and for civilian infrastructure, because currently, like, every night is a nightmare. So everywhere in Ukraine, you are under constant risk that Russian missile or Russian bomber jet will come and will destroy again your house, your like critical infrastructure, everything. So that is why, again, it's something that shall not happen even during a war, according to these rules of wars. I had to deal with Mr. Miller, who is the head of Gazprom and who is considered to be close to Putin. But I also had this negotiating experience directly with Mr. Putin. And that's why it's not like a second-hand account. I can provide my first-hand account of Putin. And at least my personal experience in negotiating with Putin directly. And by the way, it was the only time when our presidents met in person. So it was 2019, this Normandy Forum in Paris, where we had first this Normandy Forum meeting with 4 heads of state, and then there was a bilateral meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin. And I was present at this meeting, and then we started discussing the gas issues. And because I'm responsible for the gas issues, so from our side, it was me who was negotiating, and on their side, it was Putin, not Miller, not Novak, so not the Minister of Energy, not the head of Gazprom, but Putin himself negotiated about all the gas issues. So that's an obvious sign that he treats gas business as his own business. So I had this negotiating experience with Putin, and I must say that he did not look like he was crazy. He looked like a person with very different values. So when you deal with normal people, with normal businessmen, you understand that, for example, a principle of reciprocity is very important. So you are seeking a win-win solution. You are providing some kind of arguments why it is good for the other side to do certain things. So because you understand that in order to reach some kind of solution, you see, to find a common ground, you need to show that it's good for everybody. But when you negotiate with Putin, it's basically like it's all about your relative strengths. So like he is threatening you, and if you have something to say in return, to threaten him or to say that, look, we're not afraid. In our case, for example, where we're telling him, look, we arrested your assets all over Europe. We will just liquidate these assets and get our money. If you don't want to continue transit, we have a new arbitration with claims exceeding $12 billion. So we will get our money, but just through arbitration. And this was a very unusual conversation in the Western world. But that's how, again, you negotiate with Putin. And at the end of the day, it turned out to be, again, successful negotiations, because we got what we wanted. So we made him pay $3 billion to us and sign a new transit contract. So that's just an example that you have to be strong. If you have to confront Putin, and that's the only language that he understands. He probably doesn't care about his economy, but he cares about his regime. So if you want to make him reasonable, there should be a real threat to his regime, because I'm afraid that he doesn't care that much about ordinary Russians and their income and their well-being. So it's more about his regime. And also, unfortunately, for Russians at the moment, this smug feeling sometimes is even more important than their economic well-being. And that's why they should feel that they can no longer project this kind of supremacy or superiority. They cannot feel superior. So you should basically make them reasonable or punch Russia to an extent when they understand that they cannot basically be superior over other nations. But an open question is if still there is a room for a diplomatic solution over these territories rather than just a military solution. Because, as I say, human lives are important, and they're even more important than just territories. That's my personal opinion. So that's why when you say that, look, Crimea is Ukraine, you have to make sure that the way how Ukraine gets Crimea back is civilized, meaning that it does not lead to some humanitarian catastrophes or to human suffering that is not acceptable. That is again. So we should minimize to an extent possible the human suffering of any conflict. So that is why, and especially living through that, I understand that again, it is important when we do care about the human side of any kind of process, political process, military process, because again, human lives are the most important thing in life.